Hi, boys and girls. It's Miss Manning. We are working on lesson 4, which is chapter 4 of The Road to Freedom. So today we're focusing on the theme of our story using details from the text. And that could be including how the characters respond to challenges. So first we have to identify the type of fiction. The type of text. Is it fiction or nonfiction? So this is where fifth graders tend to get a little bit confused because this story is a fictional book, but there are a lot of true elements in it. But that does not make it a nonfiction story. Also, we have to identify the theme of the story. And so I'm going to kind of talk to you about what that would look like, but we're kind of supposed to ask ourselves, what are we supposed to learn from this story? And then we have to be able to summarize the events in the story. If you can't think of what's happened in previous chapters, major events, if you can't think of what's happened, major events in this chapter, you're going to be having a hard time determining what you're supposed to be learning from this story. What's the lesson, the takeaway from it? And we also have to use key details in the text to support our theme. We can't just say this is what we're supposed to learn from it without any evidence that proves what we're saying. So when we're talking about theme, it's the message or the moral of the story that the author is trying to share with you or teach you. It's also sometimes thought of as the heart of the story. What are the takeaways from it? What is the main message? Even with all of the things that happen to our character, usually they end up learning something. And the other part that makes theme really hard is it's usually unsaid by the author. We have to kind of infer it from things in the text, which means that we take the text evidence and take what we know about life and we kind of put together our thoughts about it. So, questions that you might ask yourself while you're reading that is what did the character learn? What was something that your character learned from the beginning of the book to the end, or the beginning of the book to the middle and continued learning on? How did the character change? Did the character excuse me, did the character make any big changes from how you would describe him at the beginning of the book towards the end? Or what is the message that the author is sending you? And I always tell my kids to think of it kind of like you would a TV show that you watch. If you watch a TV show, especially a lot of shows geared towards kids, there's always this lesson that they learn, like, they learn to be they can't take their parents for granted or something like that. There's all kinds of messages that they're sending you in TV shows, and it seems very obvious, and they're doing the same thing in books. We just kinda have to dig around in it sometimes. They're not as blatant about what they're saying. So the best way to identify the theme is with the use of topics. Topics are not the theme. Fifth graders tend to say, "The theme of the story is love." No, love is just the topic, so your theme is never going to be one word. The other thing I'll tell you about theme is especially once I teach my kids main idea, they always kind of confuse the two because main idea has to be very specific to your story, whereas theme is just supposed to be broad. So I always told my kids if I can take the theme of this story, whatever statement you say is the theme, and I can apply that to an episode of SpongeBob, of something that SpongeBob learns in it, then that can be the theme. My theme cannot include the characters' names. My theme can't include specific places. It has to be more general than that. So if I said the topic of the story is courage, that would lead me to the theme would actually have to be it takes courage to do the right thing. So after my students always write their themes, I ask, could I take that theme and create an entire episode of SpongeBob about it? Could SpongeBob learn about how to do the right thing because he was brave? And you could. The same thing with if the topic is justice, that's not the theme. That's just one word. So we have to move it beyond that to a theme. And maybe it's that our actions have consequences. If we do something bad, bad things might happen. Or if we do something good, good things can happen. We can have consequences. Consequences aren't always a bad thing, but I could take that very same theme and apply it to an episode on any TV show. If I say that the topic of a story is about honesty, Maybe my theme is always telling the truth. If the topic is love, the theme might be love is better than hate. Now, does that mean that every time I see this word love or I think about love of a story that the author's trying to teach me that love is better than hate? No, maybe it's true love conquers all. Maybe it's just that it's important to be with the ones that you love. There's a lot of different ideas for theme. The thing that takes theme and makes it better is if you have text evidence to support your theme. And that's why it makes it really hard for kids to do theme because there's not one answer to it. So we just have to be open to supporting it with our text evidence. So our BT dub words for our or for our book today is moss. It's a flowerless plant and it grows in damp, shady areas and it grows on the that's supposed to say the floor of the forest. In these big, huge, dense, just kind of means it's like really packed in clumps. And it can grow on the forest floor or on tree trunks. So you can kind of see it right here. And our next BT dub word is spongy. And spongy is used kind of it's an adjective, so it's describing something, and it's just this thing that feels porous and soft like a sponge. And so they're using the word spongy when they're talking about the moss that they're feeling, because when you press on moss, it's similar to when you press on a sponge. There's a give to it. All right, so in chapter 4, while you're reading, I want you to kind of think about some problems or challenges that you think are helped or kind of solved for Emma and her mom in this chapter. The rain poured buckets from the sky and soaked through every inch of us. Thank you, Mama cried, her arms raised towards the sky. For the rain? I asked, shivering. For covering our tracks and our scents. Can't no dogs find us now, she said. We started out when the sun set, but with the clouds covering the sky, I couldn't find the North Star. We ran following alongside the road, slipping through mud and wet leaves. Every time we stopped to catch our breath, Mama rubbed her hands along the trunk of the tree. Mama, what are you doing? I asked, panting. Making sure we're headed north. The moss grows on the north side of these here trunks. When we don't have the North Star, we're gonna use these trees to lead us. I reached out and felt the spongy moss on the trunk. That way? I pointed up ahead. Mama nodded, and we took off running again. The rain finally slowed to a stop, but our dresses were wet and heavy as rocks. Mama stopped. You hear that? I listened close, and just when I was about to shake my head no, I heard it. A soft rippling noise. Water? I whispered. Mama nodded, and we hurried our steps. This was the creek we needed to follow. I pretended I didn't feel scared in my chest. After a while, we smelled fire from a chimney, and high on a hill, we saw a house with a lantern in the window. We held hands as we crossed the creek, slipping on rocks. Finally, we made it to the other side. We climbed the hill toward the house, grabbing hold of tree roots and clumps of dirt. Mama reached the top first and pulled me up. The house sat in front of us, bigger up close. We hid behind a group of trees and waited. What are we waiting for, Mama? I whispered in her ear. Mama didn't answer. More time passed and an old woman came out. She carried a quilt in one arm and a quilt beater in the other. And when she reached the fence, she hung the quilt over, beat it a few times, and walked back to the house. It's safe, Mama said, and started toward the house as I hurried behind. We went around back and knocked soft 3 times. Just as Mama was about to knock again, the door opened. Welcome, the old woman said, and pulled us inside. All right, so in chapter 4, the real problem that we had encountered right before we finished that or started the chapter was that it had been raining. And they also had the slave catchers after them. So, how were those problems solved in this chapter? It tells us very early on. I also want to talk to you a little bit about the moss that that Mama feels on the backs of trees. That's a true account of how slaves were able to find the North. All right, so for our vocabulary today, our first word is shivering. It's on page 21. And shivering is a verb, which means it's an action. It's something that you do. The next word is scent. And we might all say, well, I know what scent means. It has to do with your nose. But in this case, she's talking about the rain is covering their tracks and our scent. That's not typically how we see this word. So in here, scent kind of means like the odor that we leave behind. And we have to think about what we know. Dogs are after them. Well, what do dogs do? They smell for people. That's how they're good at finding and helping locate people. Sometimes we like to use them for good now, but for them at that time, it was a bad thing. They didn't want to be found. And so the rain covered their scent. And our last word is on page 26. It's quilt. And in this case, we have a picture. And as fifth graders, we don't often get a picture to help us describe or to figure out a word. But the quilt is just that big blanket. And actually, if you see in her hand, she has this kind of, it looks like a stick with some cool things. And it says up here that she has a quilt beater in her other arm. So one arm we have the quilt, the other arm we have the quilt beater. Back before vacuum cleaners and things like that, people had, and washing machines and things like that, people had to take out their rugs, they had to take out their quilts, and they had to hit them to get all the dust and all of that gross stuff out. So it doesn't really help the smell. It probably does a little bit, but that was how they would clean big things like that. And in this case, the quilt kind of means something else, but we have to keep reading to find out. All right, on how does the simile on page 22, wet and heavy as rocks, add to your understanding of the text? So, first we have to focus on this word simile. If we don't know what simile means, we're not going to be able to answer this question. So, a simile is something that compares two things, and it always includes the word like or as. We have another figure of speech that compares two things, but it doesn't use that word, and that's a metaphor. And those are two that kids tend to get confused. So we have wet and heavy as rocks. So we're comparing something here to a rock, but what we don't know is what we're comparing. So let's read a little bit. The rain finally slowed to a stop, but our dresses were wet and heavy as rocks. So in this case, we are taking rocks and we're comparing them to their dresses. But why would they compare their rocks to their dress or their dresses to rocks? We have to think about what we know in the story, and what we know is that it's raining. So what the author is doing, figurative language is this beautiful way for the author to kind of paint a picture with his words. He's trying to help you understand that because it's raining, not only did they just barely escape the slave catchers, but now they have these dresses that are so heavy. And he uses the word rocks to really paint a picture. Like he could just say, slowed to a stop, but our dresses were heavy, but our dresses were wet. But no, he adds that word rocks in there, or she adds that word rocks in there to really just make you visualize and feel what it might be like to be soaked to the bone, running for your life, and with heavy, wet dresses on. It would just be awful. All right, and our last question is using these two pages from the text, page 21 and 22. You're going to use these two pages for text evidence, and I want you to try to come up with what you think the theme of this chapter is. Remember, if you start somewhere, start with a topic. What's the lesson that you're trying to learn? What's the topic? And then try to take that topic and create a lesson from it. You guys have had many lessons that you've learned throughout life. What is the heart, the thing that the author is trying to get you to recognize? And it's not going to be right there. It's not going to be easy. You're going to have to think about what's been going on in the story before, what's going on in the story now. But what I want you to focus on is the fact that it's raining, right? Rain poured in buckets. That's an exaggerated phrase. That's another figure of speech. So the author lets you know how badly it's raining. There's not literally buckets pouring from the sky. It just means there's a hard rain. Okay? And we had that as a problem, but it resolved itself because it covers their tracks and their scent. Dogs can't find them. Think about the characters. What are they learning or how are they responding to these problems in this chapter? That's going to help you determine the theme of this chapter. All right, that's all I have for you guys today. I will see you again tomorrow for chapter 4.